you know that buildings interact with each other a lot like people do? Some are really social, wanting to fit in. Then there are those that want to reject everything around them. And then you've got those that want to just stand out. These interactions between a building and its surrounding environment, both naturally and culturally, is known as context. And the term context is probably one of the most used words in architecture lingo. But what does it really mean? How do architects design buildings to fit within a certain context? We'll explore the origins of context and then check out some buildings and how the context affects their design. I'm Steve, and this is Architecture 101. Before we get started, be sure to like and subscribe to All Things Architecture for more interesting videos from the world of architecture. And now, let's get to our video. In looking throughout history, the term context, in an architectural capacity, is a relatively new one, beginning in the early 20th century before becoming ubiquitous with the start of the postmodernist movement in the 1960s. But the desire for buildings to relate to their surroundings is nothing new. In fact, this concept dates back to the days of ancient Egypt. In Egypt, it was believed that the gods were in control of the various forces of nature. Egyptian architects would study the natural occurrences and design their buildings in relationship to them. For example, architects would align their buildings with the path of the sun. This relationship between nature and architecture continued with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and particularly the Romans. In Rome, they believed that there were protective spirits of a specific place, known as genius loci. This concept of spirits protecting a specific place was found within parts of Asia as well, specifically Thailand and Malaysia. In the 1700s, the poet Alexander Pope redefined the term in one of his epistles to the architect Richard Boyle, in which he says, quote, "Consult the genius of the place in all," which basically suggested to architects to consider the places they were designing in and to preserve, quote, "the spirit of place." Over the centuries, the concept of genius loci remained an important part of architectural thinking. Frank Lloyd Wright was incredibly interested in making sure that his buildings fit within their natural landscape. He built his Arizona home, Taliesin West, mostly from materials sourced from the site. This concept would eventually become known as regionalism. During this time, there was also a desire to understand the way a building responds within the city. In the 1880s, the Austrian architect Camillo Sati advocated in his book The Art of Building Cities for designing buildings that stayed within the already established traditions of the city. And then came modernism. In modernism, buildings were abstractions. They were separate from the landscape they were built on. Architects like Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier shunned ornamentation and mostly rejected cultural context. Their buildings stood out and seemed to reject the city around them. For them, this was a plus. They wanted to create an architecture style void of cultural context so as to remove boundaries, to create a singular, universal culture. Hence why the style was ultimately called the International style. But then things started to change again. The constant multiplication of modernist boxes, city after city, caused a fatigue amongst architects and citizens, especially when these modernist boxes came at the loss of older buildings. Think of the Grand Penn Station in New York City, designed by McKim, Mead & White, which was a civic landmark since 1910 and was demolished in 1962 to make way for the Charles Luckman-designed Madison Square Garden. Having such important architectural landmarks replaced by faceless glass boxes indistinguishable from another caused many to rediscover the city is not simply a place for storing people and commerce, but they're our cultural legacy, and we should preserve their character, or should we say, preserve the spirit of the place. One of the early advocates of this way of thinking was the architecture professor and historian Colin Rowe. While professor at Cornell in the 1960s, Rowe saw the flaws in modernist thinking, especially their idealistic approach to designing without an understanding or appreciation of the surrounding city. He coined the term contextualism, and this coincided with the birth of the postmodernist movement, pioneered by architects like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, which advocated for the return to classical traditions and the inclusion of cultural symbolism. The idea was to design buildings that felt as though they belonged in that city. Take, for instance, the AT&T building by Philip Johnston in New York, which was among the first major examples of postmodern architecture, and fit within the definition of contextualism. It featured the traditional format of a skyscraper, a base that appeared welcoming to the street, a shaft that accentuated its height, and most importantly, a decorative top. Early skyscrapers, and especially those in New York, were known for their decorative spires and tops. The AT&T building returned that to the city. The building also was cladded in stone, something all but forgotten in the modernist era. Another more recent example is Robert M. Stern's limestone-cladded 15 Central Park West, which harkens back to the grand apartment and co-op buildings of the 20s and 30s designed by Emery Roth, with a smaller building built right on the street, mirroring the neighbor older co-op buildings, and a larger tower in the back to blend in with the neighboring skyscrapers next to Columbus Circle. It's a building that seems to respond well to its context. But here lies the issue with this version of contextualism. When the idea of context first came into being, it was taken literally. It was believed that in order to preserve the cultural heritage and spirit of a city, architects needed to copy the previous styles. But there's a problem with that. How does a city move forward if it's always looking back? Some architects did not adhere to contextualism at all. John Portman comes to mind, whose buildings turned their back on the city, creating faceless boxes that concealed an interior architectural wonderland with reflecting pools and greenery. There were also architects who continued designing modernist buildings that sat like trophies in the middle of large plazas. So this brings us to today, and our modern understanding of context. Instead of sticking to the ideas of postmodernism, which is recapturing the architecture of the past, the new thinking is to respond to a building's context not by copying, but by abstracting the elements of it and either embracing those elements or juxtaposing them. So while Stern's 15 Central Park West is a direct reinterpretation of Art Deco, the nearby 111 West 57th Street Tower, the skinniest in the world, takes a different approach. Instead of cladding the building entirely in stone, the building's exterior columns are cladded in a traditional terracotta with steel mullions in between, and the top of the building sets back in a similar fashion as older Art Deco towers. But the building still feels of the present moment. Now let's take a look at a few more examples of how architects are responding to a building's context. In Chicago, the architecture firm KPF was tasked with designing a skyscraper next to the iconic Sears Tower. They decided to embrace and contrast their imposing neighbor by first cladding the building with a rose-colored concrete, contrasting with the Sears' jet black steel. Second, the building is set back a bit from the river so as to let Sears continue to stand out. And third, the KPF tower shares similar massing as Sears, albeit at a much smaller scale, with two setbacks, and the rest of the tower continuing on. To better link the tower, not just to its site, but the city as a whole, the tower's top is reminiscent of the Tribune Tower's Gothic top across town. Now, probably one of the most intricate and interesting examples of our current understanding of a building relating to its context is found across the Atlantic in Bilbao, Spain, at Frank Gehry's famous Guggenheim Museum. At first glance, it appears as though it's a spaceship that's landed in the middle of a traditional European city. But upon further glance, there's something interesting happening. Gehry has designed the building around the city. Let me explain. The building is situated at the bend of a river, on the outskirts of the city's main downtown, with a bridge next to the site. Gehry breaks the building up into two parts. There's the portion of the building that faces the waterfront, and then there's the portion of the building that faces the town. For the facade that faces the river, Gehry leans into his artistic, fluid forms. The left side of the museum feels as though it's a fish leaping out of the water. It's mimicking the wake of the river and the natural bend of it. He's responding to the context of the landscape, and because there's nothing directly in front of the building except the river, Gehry can size up the building to create a monumental size, a museum like it deserves. On the backside, facing the city, the building takes a different approach. The titanium scales of the front facade are silenced, replaced with stone that matches in color with the stone of the older buildings. To better incorporate the building within its surroundings, Gehry added a sculptural tower on the other side of the bridge. Now the bridge is part of the museum, and the museum is part of the city. But why go to all the trouble of looking at the broader context of a site? The short answer is because it makes better buildings. Like people, buildings are better when they have an understanding of the world around them. Knowing the context, an architect can learn from what's there. They can learn from the culture and the people to create something that not only honors what's there, but brings something new and exciting to make the city a much richer place to be. And there you have it, our latest edition of Architecture 101. If you're interested in learning more about context and architecture, be sure to visit archbydesign.com. This video is part of a larger initiative we're calling All Things Architecture Classroom, a place where teachers and students can learn more about the topics we discuss here on the channel. We offer lesson plans free of charge for teachers, which include in-class activities and resources to introduce the fascinating world of architecture to the next generation. We hope you'll check it out over at archbydesign.com/classroom. Anyway, folks, I'm Steve. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time here on All Things Architecture.